This week, we're all being tempted to be distracted by the circus that is Meghan, Harry, the royal family. This is classic distraction stuff. We need to focus on the political realities of this country in crisis. We don't need for us to be spending all our time thinking about grossly overprivileged people. This is bizarre. We do not need this. What we need is real, new, grown up politics. We've had well over 130,000 deaths. The economy is going to struggle. And all the newspapers want us to focus on is a spat between members of the royal family. You know, what about the porters? What about the cleaners? What about the people who really struggle, and many of whom are having to go to food banks to keep food on the table for their children? You know, that's been pushed off the front pages now by this story about Meghan and Harry and, you know, all this kind of stuff, which is really distasteful. And it's convenient. It's convenient for the government to have the focus taken away from the crass disloyalty to the workers of the NHS who've really pulled out all the stops over the last 12 months, who are completely exhausted. Many of them suffering from stress. Remember, we've lost around 1,000 NHS staff from COVID, many of them from Black and minority ethnic groups. And here we have a good week to bury bad news, a good week to distract attention. It's beyond shocking what's happened about the proposed pay rise for NHS staff, including, of course, the nurses, but also the very low paid workers, the porters and the cleaners, many of whom have to go to food banks to put food on the table for their children. This is beyond shocking when we consider the billions that were squandered on ineffective testing and tracing programs with Deloitte and Circus, with the money that was given to Friends, to the local publican who happened to have a minister as a customer, to the hundreds of thousands that Johnson's now spent on his own residential accommodation in Downing Street. You know, this is beyond shocking. It is disgusting, and it tells us how far we've departed from the ideals of this country that we always prided ourselves on, it being about fair play and trying to do the best by everybody. This can't go on, and it won't go on. It's difficult at the moment to see what's going to happen, but something will happen. When a couple starts fighting over the money, you know, divorce is not far away. It's when trust has gone. What the health service workers need is proper recognition, proper appreciation, and there may be different ways of showing that. Partly it may be a decent financial settlement, but there may be other ways to take the stress out and to enable them to recover and get over this situation. But what this shows is just a complete lack of emotional literacy and a government which is second class at best. The political situation in response to the pandemic and where we are now is very confusing for most people who are watching this. I mean, here we have a situation where the government barely put a foot right for the first year, and the Labour Party was tearing itself apart over Jeremy Corbyn, and then Keir Starmer, and the other parties are virtually invisible on this as well. There's not really been an effective opposition. The parties have been torn about whether to get behind the government and not cause trouble in the middle of a crisis. Keir Starmer seems to be playing a long game on all of this. And then in the aftermath of the budget and the current sense of optimism around the vaccine, we see that the government has a significant lead in the opinion polls. On the other hand, at a stroke, the Chancellor of the Exchequer has alienated pretty well everybody in the health service with his 1% pay rise. We know that young people are very disenchanted with how they've been treated, whether as school children, whether as university students, whether as lower paid workers who've been made redundant in large numbers as a result of the sort of jobs that have been affected by the pandemic. And I don't think we can really form any opinion about what's going to happen next. I mean, when people who want to open the economy up quickly and get back to what they think is achievable in the form of business as usual, which I don't think is going to happen. I think we're going to have a new normal, which we don't know what it looks like yet. But I think when business as usual comes back to politics, again, I don't think it's going to be business as usual. I think there's going to be a new politics. I think there's a disenchantment in the country with all the political parties and with the very poor levels of political leadership that we currently have across the political spectrum. And, you know, it's very difficult for ordinary people who are not members of these sects that are called political parties, of people who are happy to go and sit in meetings forever and, you know, as being obsessed with committees, you know, who feel very strongly that they've been abandoned and neglected. It's very difficult, as we've seen recently, or in the last few days, very difficult for people to have street protests and to have demonstrations and so on in the middle of a pandemic. I think all this is going to change as we come out of this, as the vaccination program reaches its conclusion or gets the coverage of most people, then that normal social life in the new forms it has, because there's now much more social media social life, will begin to bubble up again. And we will see what happens. I've written and spoken on this before, but the political consequences of a pandemic like this are likely to be far-reaching. They're likely to be surprising. They are likely to build on the recognition in recent years that our political processes, our political parties, our political ways of doing things are not fit for purpose. And we'll see what happens. But it's the young ones who will forge that future, not people of my age, my vintage, as a baby boomer from just after the Second World War. We will see what the kids now coming through, going to university, going to college, going into apprenticeships in the next year or two or three, coming through their 20s, into their 30s. These are the people who are going to create our future after the pandemic. And I think they will be unforgiving of the things that have been done to them. But they won't be using the fossilized instruments of politics to make the changes that are needed. Blinded by Corona reminds you of everything that was done wrong and everything that happened from this time last year until Independence Day on July the 4th. We need to use this book as a reference point to hold this government to account.